Yeah, I've been involved with all four organizations, starting with the Council of Michigan Foundations, with the Michigan Community Foundations Youth Project, MCFIP. And then I moved for a while to the Community Foundation for Muskegon County. And from that was engaged with actually the Michigan Nonprofit Association from the early time when CMF had the Grant Maker Grant Seeker Conference that morphed and was given over to M&A. So I'd sort of watched M&A and then served on the board for a couple of years. And then the Michigan Community Service Commission was involved in some of the legwork in getting the infrastructure in place in Michigan for the commission to get organized. And then, of course, the Johnson Center, I'd been engaged as the executive director for 5 years and just have retired from there. It's my favorite kind of job description, really. I wouldn't want one that had things around it. It was a big goal. Originally, I talked to Dottie, and she said, I have a little 3-year grant from the Kellogg Foundation. I'd like you to come and just spend 3 years, and then you'll know about how foundations work, and then you can go do whatever you wanted to do. So my original commitment was for the 3 years. That was really, I learned later, an experiment about whether this would work or not. And Pete Ellis at the time was our program officer. And there were the idea was that we would help to build community foundations and engage young people as grant makers. At the time, there were some mistakes. I think it's important to point out what went wrong with that first grant, because we haven't talked about that other places. One of them was that we had not, in the first grant, said that the youth money had to be endowed. And so what happened the first 3 years is some of the community foundations spent the money, and we all looked at each other and said, oops, wait a minute, that's not what we meant. And so that was a little note to self, next time, make sure that we put that in the rules. And it was very formative. People were frustrated because they would say to us, exactly what do you want from a youth committee? And my answer would be, very general. It has to have diversity, it has to have kids under the age of 25, and the adults can't take the lead. Within that, we want you to form them. So they all were formed very differently by smart people on the ground. At the end of the 3 years, and I'm thinking, Joel, by then were you the program officer?
Yes.
Yes. So Pete Ellis had died suddenly, and Joel, when you came in, we had what would now be called in modern theory a big, hairy, audacious goal, which is one of those goals that nobody thinks you can do, but it's very inspirational. And so the goal was to cover the state of Michigan with community foundations, to engage young people as grant makers, and to bring all community foundations up to a minimum level of viability. So very general, very big, very ambitious. The wonderful thing was that the Kellogg Foundation and you supported it and said, we said, if we dream in a big way, will you support us in a big way? And when that first big grant came through, it really was permission to run and to just see what happened. So it was a fabulous experience. I would say probably I was more committed to it than I ought to have been in some ways because it became a life passion. But the Community Foundation people were so special. And there's some magic about the $1 Million Challenge, especially 20 years ago, when I could drive into a little town in Michigan and meet with local people and say, I have $1 million available to you. Here's what you need to do to get it. You could see people's eyes light up. And one of the things that would happen at the local level is that I could tell within 15 minutes whether it was going to be a really easy community foundation to put in place or whether it was going to be a tough slog over a lot of years. And it was all based on the leadership of the people in the room. If I would start to talk about what is a community foundation, what do you need to do to get this grant, how can we help you? And we also had, I should mention, support from the Mott Foundation for technical assistance to be able to support the development of the foundations. I could walk out of some community foundation community meeting and I would know immediately these people have it. I mean, they're going to call me, I'm going to have questions, but they are going to run with this thing. And other times I could walk away and I would think, we've got to keep going back because we don't have the right people yet in the room who have the vision to be able to make this happen. So I think the components of it, it was a wonderful opportunity, and the components were the fact that with your leadership, we were able to hand back to the community and say, we have a wonderful opportunity for you, but it's your opportunity. It's not, and so then my role really became one of cheerleading and hand-holding and being available by phone. Many, many times people would call me and they already knew the right answer. They just needed somebody to talk to because they were the only community foundation director in their area and they didn't know anybody else. And sometimes they would call with complicated legal questions. And then we had the real advantage of having an attorney on retainer that I could call and say, I'm not an attorney, but let me find this out for you. So for a generalist who loves community organizing, it really was the perfect job. There are people in every community who have a bigger view than their own self-interest. And I would say a couple of pieces, that relates a couple of ways to MCFIP, that there were people who could visualize how the world would be better. They were attracted to the big goal. They were attracted to the vision of not only what could be possible for their community, but also what could be possible for the state. And because it was such a big vision, it was energizing, and it allowed people to be able to get over what might be parochial. I know you've heard me say this, but I've had wonderful conversations, and sometimes just my own being surprised would hold a mirror to them. So I would be in a group I've met with two separate communities that were not 5 miles from each other, the heads of the two towns. And at one community, I was talking with them, and they said, well, we don't trust the people in the other community. And I would say, well, why? I just met with them. They seem to be really nice people. They're not ogres. And they said, well, they stole our county courthouse. And I said, oh, my gosh, they stole your county courthouse. When did they do that? Well, 1820, 4 generations ago, they stole the county courthouse. And sort of like my amazement at that, so I think some of it is just reflecting back to people what their the way that they envision their reality, and then being able to talk to them about, well, here you are now, but here's where you could be, and and you don't lose anything. That there are ways that we can structure this so that there is no harm. I think one of the things in all of the relationships in Michigan that has been critical has been people look out for each other to make sure that when something happens, that damage isn't done. Not only do I benefit, but you benefit, so that I'm not exploiting you for my own benefit. So in the case of two small community foundations, they both win. And being able to say to them, you don't have to give up anything by doing this with somebody else. In fact, together, you both will be able to win by restricting funds, by doing some things countywide that make sense to do together, and then continuing to talk with the leadership people, sometimes bringing them together for a cup of coffee and being very informal about having a conversation about, you both want to do this, how can we make this work, and then engaging them in the solutions. And we had creative attorneys, and I don't mean that in any kind of pejorative way. We were able to say to them, can we make this work this way? And the field is flexible enough that just because it hadn't been done before doesn't mean that there wasn't any reason not to do it that way. So we were able to put together partnerships and umbrella organizations that had sub-funds underneath them and other ways. And again, because of the flexibility in the grant, we were able to say to people, little community A, you probably can raise enough money to get $500,000 from Kellogg, but medium-sized community B, you might be able to raise the 2 so you could get $1 million. Well, if we put you under one umbrella, Kellogg will approve $1.5 million. So the fact that you all were willing to say, let's not punish the little community by coming together with a larger community made a huge difference. It gave us the opportunity to build win-win scenarios. Yeah, I would say that some of them reacted with horror at the idea that we were going to actually give young people $1 million. I mean, that especially, again, that's a place where that amount of money just terrified people, that young people would have that much money under their control. Some of it was cajoling, just simply saying to them, if you want the $1 million, this is what you have to do. Some took to it right away. And then some, I would say, were very resistant, and we had to work very hard to get them to go through the behaviors. And I suppose maybe it's part of that psychology of if you can get somebody to behave a certain way, eventually it becomes a part of their psychological makeup. And so we were really saying to people, do this, here's the way you need to do it. And then as they gained experience with the young people themselves sold the boards about how responsible they could be. We had tons of problems. I wouldn't want anyone to think that it was not fraught with problems. We had adults who couldn't figure out how to let go. And so we had community foundations where they would want to have, the exact rule. They wanted 50% adults, 50% kids, and then the adults wanted to run the meeting, do all the work. And we often, interestingly, they would select teachers, classroom teachers, to be the advisors to the youth committee. And what I realized over time was that teachers are used to keeping kids under control. That's the very first thing they have to do, and they're used to giving information. And so after a while, we learned that we probably needed to back off and either look for a different kind of teacher, that I don't want to judge all teachers, or that we needed someone who really, more like a coach, who was used to backing away and letting the kids make mistakes. So we learned a lot about how to do that. At Kellogg's insistence, we wanted to make sure that the youth committees were diverse. And diverse even in the sense that not only the valedictorians. Again, because the adult board was nervous, they wanted to make sure that all the kids that we had were all A kids who were highly motivated, highly structured. We're going to be successful anyway, no matter what happened to them. And involve some of the kids who were natural leaders who may not be on that same path. And that was probably the most eye-opening thing, I think, as the foundations did it in many cases because they had to. Once they did it, they began to embrace it. We also did a lot of training for the young people, and we did a lot of training for the adult advisors, and we were on the phone a lot with the adult advisors. In the end, just to complete the thought, many, I would say the majority of the community foundations now have young people on their adult board. So they're not only giving advice on the interest from $1 million, they're advising on all of the grant making. So it was an enormous and surprising success. So it was good. I think of those projects as stepping from one ice flow to another. they sort of came, The community foundations discovered, I think, through the Exxon Energy Initiative and through McPhip, that they were stronger working together than working separately. They could get more money, that they could share expertise, that they liked each other. They liked to get together. So there was a camaraderie among the community foundations. And so as one success beget the next problem, if you will. So the growth of the community foundations with additional assets and money to manage meant that they were having problems with their accounting. And so a few of the big foundations said, we're going to go after our own accounting systems. And we said, well, instead of getting your own, how about if the whole field does it? And they were able to work that through so that everybody moved together. And we actually worked with a tiny, tiny firm. It was two guys who had a dream and turned it into what is now a national accounting and software program system. But that was because we wanted to have a lot of input in the design and development. That just morphed, if you will. And I remember walking into the office at the Kellogg Foundation. It's one of my favorite moments because we had prepped and we were ready. And as I walked in, Dottie and I always went together. And Dottie is tall and I'm not, so we always sort of look like Mutt and Jeff walking in. And we walked into Joel and Russ's office, and I could tell by looking at Russ's face, or maybe your face, that we were not going to get funded. We had really worked on this, but it wasn't going to happen. And Dottie had warned me that this was not something that Kellogg normally funded, and we probably weren't going to get it. So we sort of did our best case. We had our suits on, and we were just like, okay, here's the reasons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And about halfway through the meeting, I think you were saying, well, thank you very much. We'll take this under consideration. We're really happy to have you. We thought it was, I think we might have even stood up, and we thought it was at the end. And Russ said, well, let's sit a minute. Tell me a little bit more about what this, and I could see the look on your face of, oh, whoa, this is going a different direction than I thought it was going to go. And it was a different direction than we thought it was going to go too. But it was it ended up being fabulous because you were hearing what we had to say. And it ended up being a way to begin to organize the community foundation field into some common systems that they didn't have before. And using the software as the driving factor to bring them together was a part of the reason. Jack Hopkins had the idea of having a tax credit for community foundations. It happened at the same time as the McPhip Challenge, and so suddenly we had multiple leverage points where we could say to government, if you give us $1 through the tax credit, Kellogg will give us $1 and the community will give us $2. And we could say to the community person, if you give us $2, you'll get the tax credit from the government and Kellogg will match it with $1. And we were able to say to Kellogg, if you give us $1, the community will match it with $2 and the government will match it with $1. And so out of this leveraging, everybody won. Everybody had a great, felt really good about it, and communities were able to be built. So the tax credit, the timing of the tax credit couldn't have been better. Both with the economy in Michigan, the leadership in Michigan, and having the Kellogg Challenge. Again, probably as a leverage point, because we were able, as we went in for the lobbying for the tax credit, we were able to say, here's money that will come from Kellogg as a result to your local community. It's going to be an easier way to raise it. And for the small communities, the community foundation to encouraging smaller donors was really important. And I'm sad that it's gone. I think that was, a really, it's too bad that it had to end. I know Karen Tice, who's done a lot of evaluation of McPhip, really was kept busy for her whole career evaluating all of the spin-offs that happened as a result of that one big effort. Okay. The branding project, that actually happened just as I was leaving. I left the project partly because I was tired of being gone every weekend and evenings doing planning retreats for community foundations. But the community foundations wanted to have some sense of common identity. No one knew what a community foundation was. I always had to start with, what is a community foundation? How do they function? Because no one had ever heard of them. And they had intentionally, I think, been somewhat low-key. They're more like bankers than flashy folks, old-fashioned bankers. And they went to Bob Tobin and the Williams Group here and talked to Bob about how do we capture the essence of what is a community foundation. And they went round and round and round. This was a case where I was a part of this conversation. We initially went to the Council on Foundations. And the typical pattern was that we would see a need, we would go to the Council on Foundations and say, here's a need in the field that we're seeing in Michigan. They would say, we're not interested, not ours to do. We would come back and say, okay, nobody else is going to do this. If we want it done, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And then after it's done in Michigan, then it goes back and becomes a national project. So the branding project certainly was one of those. We went and we said, the field needs to have a common branding. They said, we don't think we could. In fact, they might have failed at a couple of early efforts at it. And then the Michigan folks came back and they got together in a group and they worked with Bob and they worked on projects. And eventually they came up with the phrase, for good forever, which is it really captures the essence of the community foundation. And it required the community foundations some of them to change their names because they were just the Kalamazoo Foundation and so they had to, or the Fremont Foundation, and they had to change their names to the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, the Fremont Community Foundation. The other thing that it did, and was a result of the tax credit, but is related, was that once we passed the tax credit, then we needed a clearer definition, a legal definition, legal description about what a community foundation was, because every little organization in Michigan was renaming itself a community foundation so that they could be eligible for the tax credit. And so that took probably a year and a half of very hard hammering out among the community foundations, again in Michigan, about exactly legally what does it mean to be a community foundation. Lots of reading of the IRS tax code and going back into the '69 Tax Act and a lot of tough kind of research. But that definition then became the base of what is now the national definition and the start of standards for community foundations. So all of those were spinoffs. I would say that the one thing that is probably hubris on my part, but is that I always think that if I don't know something, I can learn it. So learning to give would be really, I know almost this much. I mean, I only know enough about education because I went through school. I don't know very much about the formal structure of K-12 education. And yet I had real passion for this. I mean, this was a place that I thought, if we're ever going to make a difference in the world long term, it's going to be to make sure that the next generation really understands and has the experience that neither you or I ever had the luxury of having. I mean, there just weren't these programs when we were kids, or even in college or graduate school. So Dottie had put together an advisory committee to first talk about, does this make sense, of key funders, of people like state school board members, of Jim Kelly, who had put together the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, other people who were a cross mix of foundation people and education people. So that committee stayed in place, and I wrote, as I was a part of the committee, and then I wrote the grant to the Kellogg Foundation for Learning to Give. And at the time, it was called a very jazzy title, the K-12 Education and Philanthropy Project, which nobody could pronounce, no one could remember, but it was descriptive of what we were doing. So the first thing that we did was, at the advisory committee, in talking with the head of the social studies for the state of Michigan, and teachers, classroom teachers, they said, it can't be done. They said everybody in the world wants to put their curriculum into the K-12 curriculum. That the teachers put up a wall the minute that they hear that, oh, here's one more thing that we're gonna be asked to do with no money and with no, benefit. And even if they believed in it, that they're just, overwhelmed. Standardized testing was coming in at that time, and they were overwhelmed by the move to having to standardize their curriculum. And the best phrase I remember from Jim Kelly said, you're being asked to do something that the education system is set up to resist. So just know going in that, they are not going to want to do this. And so we made the decision that we would go in at the grassroots. Most people develop these kind of projects for schools by going from the school board down and by asking university professors to write, curriculum for the kindergarten teacher. We threw that out and said, what we're going to do is we're going to make this owned by classroom teachers. It's going to be grassroots, it's going to be teacher-focused, and we're going to honor teachers as professionals, and we're going to treat them for what they know. And so we recruited teachers, and frankly, we used a carrot of being able to give them a computer, because we wanted it to be a virtual system in order to be able to cover the UP, Northern Michigan, Southern Michigan, urban schools, private schools, suburban schools, and make sure that we have religious schools, that we had all of the different types of K-12 education in that first pool of teachers. And then I hired as an assistant a long-time, highly respected classroom teacher, social studies teacher out of Detroit. And he became the coach on how to look at this from the classroom teacher point of view. And we began to meet with them. We met with them. We said, here's what we want to do. We want to teach philanthropy. And then we spent about a week talking with them about the fact that it's not just giving rich people, having rich people give money to poor people, that we wanted to redefine it. And we sent out a survey to the top thinkers in the field, about 35 people who have really thought deeply, and we asked them, what should a graduating high school student know about philanthropy, and what should they be able to do? What should be their attitudes? Got those surveys in. We sent out the answers to everybody. They answered again, and eventually, from that research process, we came up with some major ideas that needed to be transmitted to the next generation. We took those general ideas to the teachers, and we said, here's the ideas we want to be taught, but you all know how to teach it. So would you help us turn these into standards and benchmarks that work for you? And I think the key to Learning to Give was, we said, it cannot be additional work. We have to integrate this curriculum in a way that you can teach what you are already being expected to teach, but just from this lens of philanthropy and giving. And I would say one of the examples I've always used is every fourth grade teacher in Michigan teaches about the Underground Railroad. It's a part of American history, it's always taught, but no one except Learning to Give teachers talks about the fact that they were all volunteers, and that the conductors and the abolitionists, and how do people organize themselves to stand up to an unjust law, that there is this richness in your normal curriculum that you can get at by teaching it through this philanthropic lens. And so we had the luxury, because of Kellogg funding, to do a lot of things that I think of as being right. We had a fairness review committee. We were able to field test lessons before they went into the classroom. And then, of course, the wonderful piece for me is that we were able to demonstrate philanthropy, because we said to the teachers, if you'll write the lesson plans, we will, for free, we will put them on the website with your name, and that will be your contribution to philanthropy. And with that, we promise that these materials will be available for free forever for all teachers. So it still is available. It's still free. It's they're getting about 2 million hits from teachers and downloads a year. It's developed with, we asked the graduate students at the new Centers on Philanthropy to write briefing papers that are kind of like cliff notes, because we couldn't, we knew that teachers weren't going to know anything about this content, and it would be unfair to ask them to teach something that they were not familiar with. So they could have a little briefing paper on people, ideas, or organizations, and that would give them some background material. And then we did a lot of seminars and workshops and those kinds of things. So it's a fun project. It's still going on. And suddenly we flipped from being an add-on to being a help, because they were going into the teaching, they had to teach to the standards. A lot of times they might get, for example, a new teacher might get on a Monday a report from their principal that all their kids, didn't do well on this part of the social studies test. They could go in and look at that benchmark, and all of a sudden there would be 10 good lessons written by outstanding teachers that would help them teach the academic benchmark, but through this lens of philanthropy. I would say the other thing that made it work was that it was led by teachers inside the school. So there was, what we would say to the principals is, we would love it if you just wouldn't get in the way. You don't just don't say no. Let's see what your teachers will do. And the teachers would convince each other. The students would be talking about it, and so it really bubbled up rather than coming from their school a board saying you must do this and do this way. That happens to teachers almost once a month. They're my favorites, actually. So I had one kindergarten teacher said, well, someone had said to the group of teachers, well, you can't have them use a word like philanthropy. We need to find a simpler word. And the kindergarten teacher turned around and she said, well, they can say Tyrannosaurus Rex. So it's just a matter of them, getting the picture in their mind. With the little people, everybody has something that they value. And so for adults, often it's money that they value. But for little kids, it could be a toy. It could be their time. Most children are sort of naturally compassionate, particularly about animals. And so a lot of times working with children about doing something that's of benefit to animals, asking them to donate their toys that they don't play with very often. I would say to the teachers about the lesson plans, you at that point don't want to talk with little children about sacrificial giving. I mean, you don't want them to give their favorite bunny, but to give some of the things that they have to children who have less. It's amazing how generous children are, and that having words to be able to talk about that really helps them also figure it out. You can see their brains working, that they're figuring it out. The little people are really great at it, at understanding the meaning, at doing service. They love to be asked to do service. And unfortunately, in our schools, we too often have the kids raising money that benefits them. So they're out raising money for it's a cookie sale so that their hockey team can go someplace, or their choir can get new robes, or those kinds of things. I think it's a very new idea for kids to raise money or to do service that benefits somebody else. And there is something very authentic about what about what we all get from giving. And it's sort of an evaluation of I am a support for the fact I am a good person. And, you know, in our culture, often we tell kids, oh, you're wonderful, you're wonderful, you're wonderful, but they don't feel like they have earned it, and so they don't internalize it. The one nice thing about learning to give is that they both have a language and experience that it doesn't matter if somebody tells them they are a good person, because the act itself reinforces a very authentic way of building confidence and a good character, I think. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that until really that period, not only were there multiple state standards, every school system set their own standards. So, you know, depending on where you went to school was what you learned. There was no common core curriculum. And we also, from the survey that I mentioned, we developed standards for philanthropy education. So there are standards and benchmarks, measurable benchmarks for what a student should learn at 5th grade, at 9th grade, and at 11th grade. So they should be able to define philanthropy at kindergarten as the giving of time, talent, and treasure for the common good. And then by 9th grade, they should be able to define it as intended for the common good. So there's the idea of intentionality, and sometimes things go wrong, but you meant for it to be good. And then when you get to high school, it really is about the deeper philosophical pieces of it. I've forgotten exactly how the benchmark's written, but those the benchmarks build. We began with Michigan standards because we frankly thought it was going to be a Michigan program. We had started out looking for a national program to bring to Michigan, and it was when we didn't find one that we decided to do Learning to Give, and we hadn't originally thought that it could go nationwide. So we started by coding it, hand coding it, as in teachers sitting in rooms looking at a lesson plan and saying by hand, actually typing it in, but this fits this code and this code and this code. As the benchmarking system and standardized testing went across the country, probably 5 years into Learning to Give, we were getting more and more national attention, and there became a software company that actually converts the lesson plans. So we were able to put a lesson plan in and standardize it to Michigan, and then it could convert it to all of the other state standards. So now what can happen is a teacher from anywhere can go in, type in the state they're in, and it will give them the converted version of it. So there are 50 versions of 2,000 lesson plans that any teacher can download. And they're downloadable so that the other thing we knew was that no teacher ever teaches the lesson plan the way that's written. They all teach it on the fly, and they have a guide, but they teach it as, because teaching is an interactive process. And so the lesson plans can be downloaded so that the teachers can just change them in their computers. And nobody cares about ownership. And I would say that is one of the things, kind of as an aside, that I have valued so much about the whole field of philanthropy, is that it has really been about giving. And in community foundations and in Learning to Give, nobody has cared about copyright. Nobody has cared about ownership of material. Everybody has freely sort of thrown their potato in the stew pot, you know, and I've got meat, and we'll see what we get. And I really value that piece of it. One of my friends long ago said, you know, I know that I've succeeded in my career when I read my own writing coming back in somebody else's brochure. And the field has always had that kind of giving in it. Yeah, I think there are commonalities. One is the process from the conception of the idea through the grant. They were fairly common processes. And I think that was first, somebody had an idea, and then all of the potential stakeholders were brought around the table. And I'm sure some private conversations with funders who might be interested, but just saying, come to the table, let's see if this idea has any validity or not. Learning to Give is a good example. I think that idea cooked for several rounds before it finally got legs underneath it. But the timing wasn't quite right, or people weren't sure it could happen, or Cal had worked on that for a while, I think, before it actually kind of moved forward. And then it would be having enough of the ideas gel to be able to form a general framework of, again, big, hairy goals that were, here's what we want it to look like 10 years from now. but not prescriptive about how we're going to get from here to there. This, let's put out what we want it to look like and then see what happens. The grant written, and this is where Kellogg was brilliant funders, and you, Joel, were a great program officer for it. We're able to work and say, let's have the faith that the work will be done, that honest work will be done. There will be failure, and I know you covered for me several times when there was failure, and that we would learn, and that we would learn and grow, and that people would be working hard. But there was a tolerance for failure in the process. And then engaging the people who actually are doing the work in the process of creation and in making it their own. It's really important that it not be top down. It's messier, it's longer, it's more frustrating. In both cases, there was a huge educational component. And in one case, educating community members about what is a community foundation. In another case, educating teachers about what is philanthropy and philanthropy education. And it means a lot that people have background, the background to make decisions. And given the background, they typically will take big ideas and run with it. So I think, I can't also discount the importance of the fact that there was money, that we were not starved to death like some good ideas are. We always knew that it's not like they were rich projects, but there was enough that I wasn't always having to go out and meet with donors and spend half of my time raising money at the same time as I was trying to do the work. And I always had the faith, and you all gave us the faith, that if we did good work and if we could come back and show that we had done the work and had achieved the objectives, that you were still on the same team with us, and that we wouldn't be, making cookies for bake sales in order to be able to write the next lesson plan, made a huge difference. Learning to Give had made the decision that we were becoming international quickly. And I knew that in order to be able for it to grow, I had to let it go, because I wasn't at a point in my life where I wanted to do national travel and all of those things. And I had looked at the Johnson Center job several times before when it was open, and I was always in the middle of a big project and never could have put my hat in the ring. This time it happened to coincide with what was happening with Learning to Give. I had wished all my life that there had been something like the Johnson Center when I was a freshman in college, because all the way along I had pieced together the information that I knew I wanted to learn, and it never was in one place. And in some cases it hadn't been created yet because the field is so new. So the idea of the Johnson Center is very attractive. Your being here, the grant-making school, I really respected the people who were at the Johnson Center and who had the vision for it being national. Being an entrepreneurial person inside a big institution is a challenge. And I knew this about myself coming in, that it was going to be a challenge, because when people tell me, no, you can't get that pencil right now because we can't afford it, someone says no to me, I'm usually like, okay, what are the 5 ways we can get around the no, and still be legal? So this is not a good trait to have in university. So I would say it was challenging in the fact that I always felt like I was pushing against what was generally a very supportive system. I mean, I think Grand Valley is very entrepreneurial. It just is a big system, and it's a big system that is designed for the purpose of educating undergraduate students, not for the purpose of supporting Kathy Agard's dreams for the Johnson Center to take over the world with philanthropy education. So I would have to remind myself that we were not the essence of Grand Valley. We were fortunate to have this big institution as support. The joy part of it has been that we've had a great deans who have been responsible for the center, who really buffered that institutional presence and let us go so that it was possible to do some creative things. certainly the Johnson Center building, being able to move from, we were deep inside the university structure, and so it was hard for people from the outside to feel very welcome. I think that you coined the term that we were like the Motel 6, because all of the offices were in a row down a line, and everybody had their doors closed, so no one would talk to each other. And Grand Valley let us design the space for the Johnson Center so that it was very open, somewhat off campus, so that people were, we could become a real community place and a boundary spanning organization for the university, where we were taking university resources, intellectual resources, to be able to be helpful to the work of foundations and nonprofits in the community. And the community people would feel more welcome to come in. So I think in terms of general contributions during those 5 years, that would be one of the things that I am happy about. During the whole 5 years, we struggled for money, and partly that was a result of changes at the Kellogg Foundation in their programming focus and how they managed that transition, because it was very up and down about were we going to be funded, were we not going to be funded. And so it became very challenging to take on a project. In many ways, a center that has the kind of research base that the Johnson Center has, it's kind of like being an emergency room, in that you have to have the emergency room open all the time, even though there may only be a major accident, once every 5 years. You can't, at the 5-year mark, when somebody's in your parking lot, say, oh my gosh, we've got to hire some surgeons and some anesthesiologists. And so there's an ongoing expense to keep the research capacity open, even though there's not, it's sort of like a consulting business. How do you keep the capacity there when you don't have a steady stream of dollars coming in necessarily? It's very up and down. So that was a challenging piece of wanting to have the center recognized as Michigan's Center on Philanthropy, and to be owned by the field as their Center on Philanthropy, and yet not being sure that the foundation world in particular, was ready to invest in it the way that it ought to be invested in. I think there's a lot of human talent in the world. And so I think it's a matter of letting people use their talents and recognizing what they are, rather than feeling like there's a paucity of it. There really is a lot. In Michigan, I do think we have all benefited from these extraordinary leaders, and they have been extraordinary leaders in so many ways. But one of them is that they have nurtured talent, and they have allowed people to take responsibility, and they have a piece that I have appreciated so much was that, for example, the program officers from Kellogg would sit with us. So I never felt like you were sitting in judgment of us, but that you were partners, and that we had work to do, and our job was to get out there and and be out there in the middle of the night getting the snow off the windshield in the Upper Peninsula, and that the foundation's job was to be there cheering us on and also calling us up short if something was going wrong, but that it was a partnership and not a power relationship. And I think that part came out in the human talent, in that the program officers have enormous human talent and connections to the best thinking in the world. And so to have them at the table, goes into the knowledge piece, but both the talent and the knowledge to say, we're your partners and we're willing to share what we know. And all together, I'm always a Quaker admirer, and I always think that each of us hold a piece of the truth. And so if everybody brings it together, you get a much richer understanding of what's going on, and both in terms of talent and in terms of knowledge that was brought to the table in many ways on these projects. Money is certainly important, but I have, and maybe I've been spoiled by Michigan, but I do really believe that money follows good ideas and energy. And that if you care about it, I suppose I learned this from Dottie. I think I even remember, I can hear her voice in the back of my head right now saying it, that she who cares enough about it and is willing to sort of go the extra mile, that money will follow, because people want to be engaged in success and in projects and things that are interesting and things that make a difference, and that money will follow that kind of good work. And I guess I've just believed that my whole life. You need to commit to do it, that you think infrastructure is important. You need to be thoughtful about that you have everyone who needs to be there, and to fault on the side of inclusion rather than exclusion. If you have a question about whether a foundation should be invited in or not, invite them in. If you have a question about should the teachers become involved, involve them, so fault on the side of being inclusive. It does make a difference to have a big goal. I think setting a big, clear goal, not down to the minuteness of it, but just a goal like we're going to have the strongest association of nonprofits in the country, and we'll know we do when we can influence tax policy for the benefit of people in our community. Something like, but big goals. And then one of the things we benefit by in Michigan is that people naturally have developed relationships, but I also think that they have an understanding that they need to nurture their relationships. And so people get in the car and they actually drive to the Upper Peninsula. They drive over to Detroit, or from Detroit they drive over to Muskegon. Michigan is a big state, and still people get together. They take the time to get together. They talk with one another. They josh one another. They go to dinner. I mean, I think all of those kinds of things help it when things go wrong, so that when the natural tension happens, that will happen as you're trying to do something new, you have trust in the other people that it just went wrong. I mean, it was just a mistake. Not that there was any ulterior motive or that there was any other thing other than just life is messy and sometimes things happen, and that everybody is trying to help each other out. So being intentional about developing those relationships might seem a little odd at first, but it's incredibly important. I would say that there are strong, smart, educated people who have been in positions of power who didn't necessarily agree. And so it's not pettiness, it's actual disagreement about, and I can think of a couple. One is the disagreement about whether strategically it makes you allow a small community to develop its own community foundation within a big geographic area that another community foundation has already staked out as their service area.
Community Foundation for
Southeastern Michigan. Very tough issue. Their Community Foundation for Southeastern Michigan is 7 counties. They feel very strongly that they need to harness all of the resources of the region in order to save the largest city in Michigan and one of the largest in the country. And you have a small group of donors in a suburban community who say, no, we don't want to do that. We want our own little suburban community foundation. We're not going to send our money to Detroit anyway, to the Regional Community Foundation. We have the right to give our money anywhere we want to. Very difficult and honest conflict. I mean, these are 2 very different points of view, and how do you wrestle with that? I think those kinds of issues came up. Around the tax credit, there was a very difficult issue about if we're in the business of endowment building, and that's what makes us distinctive, and we only want big gifts at the end, typically at the end of a person's life, or when they're in a position where they can make a big endowment gift. All of a sudden we're switching and saying we're going to give you a tax credit for a little gift from people who are making donations out of their checkbook. Huge change for the field, and not without people who were resisting and saying, no, you're stepping into the United Way's world, you're causing all kinds of conflict. This isn't something we ought to be doing. Those were probably the most, around the definition of a community foundation. Some people, we had a huge argument at the very beginning of McPhip, because the Council on Foundations had a belief that you needed a community of 150,000 people in order to have a successful community foundation. Well, the people who believed that were people who had community foundations in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, and, San Francisco, and really big cities. So it was hard for them to fathom that Fremont could have a $200 million foundation, or that Grand Haven could have, a $75 million foundation now, or that, and so we were, I would say, blackballed is probably not too strong a word, by the whole field, because we thought it was okay. I mean, part of the philosophy was that all philanthropy is good, and that you need to nurture it wherever it is, and that people in the local community and donors, it's their money. They should give it where they want to. So that resulted in a lot of controversy about our starting a lot of community foundations in small towns. And it has resulted, I mean, in, I hope, disproving that concern, because where they actually were too small, they have now combined into these bigger entities to get enough scale to be successful. And where there has been any problems in the community foundation world, they actually have been in the big foundations. Because the truth is, the IRS is going to be a whole lot more concerned about something happening at the Chicago Community Trust than they are something happening at the Alpena Community Foundation. Again, just because of scale, a small foundation. So there was a lot of controversy. I wouldn't say that it went wrong. I would say there was controversy, and we decided to ignore it and say, we understand, we hear what you're saying, we think you're wrong, and go ahead and do it anyway. During this period of time, it is an interesting transition, really. I remember at the start of my career being taught that you went to a private foundation and got money, seed money, and it was used to test a project and to see whether it was viable or not. And then if it was viable, you would either go to United Way and become a United Way agency, or United Way would support the ongoing support, or you'd go to government if it was a bigger project and would become a government project. So in the course of these, 25 years, 30 years of my career, that really changed completely. And the first thing that changed was the start of the United Way, I think, got lost. It got lost, and it had, I've told my friends, I often think of them as a heat-seeking missile that had lost its target. And so it's this big institution that lost its way. And where it lost its way is when it gave up the idea of member associations and funding ongoing support. They were the only ones that the nonprofits could rely on in a community for ongoing sustained support for the kinds of institutions that every community needs. So the child welfare organization, the adoption organization, the the homeless shelter organizations, those that are grinding out the work of trying to make a better community every single day, but may not be glamorous to a funder because it's just, they're paying the lights and the heat and trying to find beds for the shelter, those kinds of things. At one point, United Way just gave up on that and wanted to become community planners, and that was a start of, I think, more of the conflict. Then with McPhip and Kellogg's interest in supporting the development of community foundations, we tried really hard to keep those roles straight and to say, okay, one is the checkbook, one is the bank account, one's a savings account, and to say these are how they're different. The tax credit, actually, Dottie went to United Way and asked them if they would like to be a part of the tax credit. Is the backstory that we probably will sequester. But United Way said, you can never get it. You'll never get it through. We don't want to put the energy into it. And so, no, thank you. We don't want to be a part of it. When it got through, then there was a lot of interest of, oh my gosh, you guys are going after checkbook giving. You're going after the smaller donor. You're trying to eat our lunch. So there was the irony, of course, is that any of us could have worked for either organization. This is the same group of people same group of caring people, same group of people with the same motivations, but they were looking after their institutional welfare. What I would say at the local level is that it would be up to the board. And the board members as community leaders probably sat on both boards or had sat on both boards at some point in time, and that their job was to keep their executive directors in check and to keep them from being too competitive. And that their job as community leaders was to make sure that the organizations would find a way, whatever that local way is, of working together. Now, one of the things that happens with the tax credit was once we figured out that the United Way agencies could use the tax credit for their endowments, that helped. And so then United Ways were beginning to help use the United Way could use the community foundation. So instead of there being parallel, they suddenly had mutual benefit. I think some of the community foundations tried to underwrite and gave grants to underwrite. I mean, I know they did, but not every community foundation underwrote some of the operating costs for the United Way itself, so that it could raise money by saying every dollar we raises going out into the community, that your dollar gift to United Way doesn't have to go to overhead, because the community foundation funded that overhead. So there were some very creative things that happened at the local level, but it is one of the places where that powerful set of board volunteers need to take off their individual organizational hat and say what's best for the community. And I don't say that about their executive directors, again, in any derogatory way. The executive directors were hired to protect and build their institutions. And then it's up to the board members to say to their directors, no, this isn't the way we're going to do it here. We want you to get along with your compatriot. Worked in some places, didn't work in other places. I know it's still an issue somewhat nationally, and it'll just get worked out over time. I'm not from a wealthy family. From what I now understand was probably a lower class working family. I just didn't know it at the time. It didn't occur to me that we didn't have everything we needed, because my parents were great parents. And my dad worked in the shop, worked in a gray iron foundry. My mother was home all the time with us. But my parents were very civically engaged. They just were. My dad went to work, took the early shift from 6:30 to 2:30 so he could come home. And then at 2:30, I always said his real life started. He had been a founder of our city. He was a vice mayor. He was the founder of the local volunteer fire department. My mother was the person before 911 that you'd call when there was a fire, and then she would be the person to call all the volunteer firemen. And if you know anything about volunteer firemen, they're kind of a clan, So I grew up in the family of the volunteer firemen who all were out there, trying to protect the community. So I was involved in politics. One of my earliest memories is handing out leaflets for my dad for an election that he lost, but we survived it. He had been a justice of the peace, so he married people in our living room, and we were told to go sit on the steps and shush, while people were getting married. So I guess that, rather than money, even more so rather than traditional service, although my mother was always the PTA mother and always the Girl Scout leader and doing all of those things, it was more about civic service or your responsibility to the community. That was a part of my gift from my parents. I was very involved in school, and then was able to go to college on a scholarship funded by the Knight Foundation. In fact, I had the chance to thank them once a few years ago for the fact that they had underwritten the chance, because otherwise I would have gone locally to community college and not had a chance to go away to school. And so I went away to Albion and had scholarships all the way. And what that does is it really begins to plant a sense of enormous gratitude for people I didn't know. I've never known their names. I have no idea who some of the others were, that made such a big difference in my life. I had wanted to coach high school debate. There were no jobs, so I took a job just for a job as a community organizer, and bringing people with handicaps and mental conditions back from the big institutions. Michigan was just deinstitutionalizing at the time. That was my first job. And went back and got a degree in a master's degree in public administration. And over a while, I began to realize that what I really liked was happening in the nonprofit sector. I got a first job as an executive director of a small nonprofit, half-time, because I was home with 2 small babies. And a friend of mine called up and said, "You're getting your master's degree in public administration. How'd you like to actually do it?" And so I took that job, and then one job kind of led to another. So it hasn't been planned. It's been haphazard. And I've told my own children, and I've told the students in my graduate classes here, that you can sort of prepare, but you really can't plan. You just never know where life's going to take you. And it certainly has been a wonderful series of opportunities. I've never had a job that was funded beyond 3 years. So I always knew that like I said, it always just felt like one of those, it's Uncle Tom's Cabin, isn't it, where they run from ice floe to ice floe? It has been that kind of a career where, at the end of 2.5 years, I start to think, okay, what will I do if we don't get funding? But it's always come through, and so we were able to step to the next project. I think of myself as a workman, that there were all of these big forces out there, but that somebody needed to get in the car and go have the conversation in Greenville. And that was so I feel like I was part of this bigger picture that was really exciting and a wonderful part, and I was made to feel valued, but that my job was the on the ground, getting out there, making it happen kind of job, which I'm thrilled with. I mean, that's what I like to do. And I hope that it's remembered as having made some long-term difference to our communities, for us, for our family, and for everybody in Michigan.